The year was 1839, and the lands of Willow Marsh Estate, nestled in the mist-thick lowlands of Virginia, carried with them a silence that was heavier than any storm. The mansion itself rose like a ghost out of the cypress groves, a once proud plantation house now streaked with weather stains and ivy, its columns chipped and leaning like teeth of an ancient skull. Those who lived nearby, tenant farmers, overseers, and the enslaved scattered across the neighboring fields, rarely spoke of Willow Marsh. If they did, it was with lowered voices as though the house itself might overhear. They whispered of the gatherings that took place there, nights when a dozen or more carriages rolled quietly down the dirt road, their lanterns shuddered. Shadows of men in fine coats disappeared through the tall oak doors, not returning until dawn. No music played, no dancing echoed from the windows, yet the air afterward carried the weight of smoke and iron, like blood long cooled. Eliza Harrow, daughter of the estate's master, had lived in that house her entire life. She had learned, as children do, what should never be spoken aloud. Her father, Silas Harrow, was a man the county praised for his wealth and his generosity, a gentleman who donated to churches and schools. Yet behind the plantation gates, his kindness turned sharp. He locked his daughter away when she asked too many questions. He struck servants for the smallest mistakes. And when the gatherings of his brethren began, he warned Eliza never to step foot near the cellar. But Eliza was not like other daughters of plantation society. She had her mother's pale, mournful eyes, and a mind that could not sit idle. The silence pressed on her until it felt like suffocation. She began to write, at first little observations, and then longer entries, each bound into secret journals she hid beneath the loose boards of her chamber floor. She wrote about the men who arrived in the night. She described the stains she found on her father's clothes, the ledger she once glimpsed in his study, marked with columns of names that seemed less like property lists and more like accounts of lives taken. If Silas Harrow knew of her writings, he might have burned her journals or worse. But she guarded them with care, believing that someday someone must know the truth of Willow Marsh. Among the enslaved on the estate, whispers spread just as steadily. They spoke of disappearances, men and women taken from quarters at night, never seen again. They spoke of strange fires in the swamp and of carved symbols left on the cypress trees. The overseers mocked such fears as superstition. Yet one man among them knew differently, for he had seen it with his own eyes. Jonah Cross had been born into slavery in Virginia but had the spirit of someone who could not be broken. Tall, strong, and deliberate in his movements, he carried himself with a dignity that no lash could take. In the fields, the others looked to him for quiet guidance. And though he spoke rarely, his eyes revealed a fire that watched everything. Jonah had seen men dragged toward the cellar doors on nights when the brethren gathered. He had heard the muffled cries. He had watched overseers dispose of ash buckets in the swamp, their contents black and foul. Like Eliza, he carried a memory that would not fade. Unlike her, he had no place to write it down, only his mind, sharp and relentless. It was inevitable, perhaps, that Eliza and Jonah's paths would cross. One night, restless and unable to sleep, Eliza slipped from her chamber and drifted toward the back of the house. The cellar door was ajar, a line of light spilling out. She crouched low, peering in. And there, across the flickering candle glow, she saw Jonah, carrying wood, his face a mask of practiced indifference while his eyes darted to the altar at the cellar's center. On that altar lay something that made Eliza's breath hitch. A book bound in cracked leather, a ledger of sorts, its pages filled with writing. Jonah glanced up and saw her. For a heartbeat, neither moved. A white daughter of the house and an enslaved man, each seeing in the other what could never be spoken. Then footsteps echoed above, and Jonah shut the cellar door swiftly, masking her presence. In the days that followed, Eliza found herself haunted by that brief encounter. For years she had wondered if her suspicions were madness, if the journals she wrote were nothing but a daughter's imagination fueled by loneliness. But Jonah's eyes had confirmed it. He knew. He had seen. And if she was brave enough to seek him out, perhaps they could piece together the full horror of Willow Marsh's secret. That chance came weeks later, on an autumn afternoon when the marsh was swollen from rain. Eliza slipped from the house with a basket, pretending to gather herbs. She found Jonah by the edge of the cypress grove, chopping wood. At first he ignored her, his axe biting into the stump with a rhythm as steady as a drumbeat. But when she spoke his name, softly, he froze. "You saw it too," she whispered. "Didn't you?" Jonah did not look up. His jaw tightened, and for a long moment, Eliza feared he would strike her down just for speaking. Then he set the axe aside and met her gaze. "I've seen more than you could bear," he said. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll forget it." But Eliza shook her head. I cannot. If I close my eyes, I hear them. I smell the smoke. My father, he keeps a ledger. I've seen it. Pages of names. Some crossed out. Some marked with symbols. I must know what it means. Jonah's expression darkened, but there was something else there too, something like recognition. They think no one sees, he murmured. But we do. And we remember. In that moment, a fragile bond was forged, not of trust, but of necessity. Each carried pieces of a truth too heavy for one person alone. Each risked death by acknowledging it. But in the marshland shadows of Virginia, secrets had a way of festering until they demanded reckoning. The estate itself seemed to groan under the weight of what it held. At night, the old cypress trees moaned in the wind, their roots twisting in the mud like buried bodies trying to claw their way free. The enslaved told stories of ghosts wandering the groves, women in torn dresses, men with chains still clinging to their wrists. Children were warned never to wander near the swamp after dusk. Eliza, though skeptical of such tales, could not deny the heaviness in the air, the way even the animals avoided the path near the cellar. By the winter of 1839 the stage was set. The brethren had sent word of another gathering at Willow Marsh, one that promised to be larger than any before. Carriages would arrive again, bearing men whose names adorned the county's finest churches and courts. And beneath the house, in the flickering candlelight of the cellar, another ritual would be carved into the memory of those too powerless to speak. But Eliza Harrow was no longer content to remain silent. And Jonah Cross, though shackled in body, carried a fire that chains could not quench. Together, though neither yet knew it, they were preparing to face the darkness of Willow Marsh Estate, an evil rooted not only in their fathers and masters, but in the very soil of the land itself. The house loomed at dusk, its windows like hollow eyes watching. Waiting. The first frost of winter crept across Willow Marsh, crisping the reeds of the swamp and silvering the grass beneath the moonlight. The estate appeared almost beautiful in that brittle stillness, yet beauty at Willow Marsh was always a disguise. Inside its walls, secrets festered, coiling tighter with every gathering of the brethren. Eliza Harrow had grown skilled at moving unseen within her father's house. Silas Harrow believed her broken, subdued by years of confinement and scorn. He never imagined his daughter capable of quiet rebellion. But Eliza had patience, and in silence she had sharpened her mind. She listened at doors. She learned the schedules of the servants. She memorized the keys jangling from her father's belt, their shapes and grooves etched in her mind. One evening, after the household had gone to sleep, Eliza slipped into her father's study. The room smelled of pipe smoke and leather, lit only by the glow of embers in the fireplace. His desk loomed like an altar, papers stacked neatly, a heavy lockbox resting to one side. She moved quickly, for every second risked discovery. Beneath the false bottom of a drawer, her fingers found what she had been searching for. A large, cracked ledger bound in dark calfskin, its pages stiff with age. She opened it by the fire's glow. Her breath caught. The ledger was no ordinary account book. Instead of cotton yields or debts, the columns listed names, scores of them, alongside strange markings. Some names were crossed out with heavy strokes of ink. Others bore symbols Eliza did not recognize. Circles, triangles, lines slashed through letters. Scrawled notes in the margin spoke of offerings and rites fulfilled. She turned the pages with trembling hands, and on one of them her own mother's name appeared. Noted beside it, departed, sanctified. Eliza's throat tightened. She had been told her mother died of fever when Eliza was barely a child. But here, in her father's own hand, was evidence of something else entirely, something far darker. Her heart pounded as she snapped the book shut, tucking it beneath her shawl. She had only moments to return before her absence was noticed. Back in her chamber, she placed the ledger beneath the floorboards with her journals, hands shaking so violently she could barely fit the planks back into place. 4 days afterward, she felt its presence beneath her feet like a living thing, calling to her, daring her to open it again. Each time she did, the horror deepened. The ledger chronicled decades of rituals, sacrifices, and gatherings of the 13 Brethren of Willow Marsh, prominent men whose names adorned county records and church pews. Judges, landowners, merchants. All bound together in secrecy and cruelty. Eliza's writings took on a feverish pace. She copied passages, sketched symbols, noting each victim's name with care. She no longer wrote only for herself. She wrote to preserve memory, to ensure the truth could never be buried again. But she was not the only one who knew. Jonah Cross had his own fragments of knowledge, gathered through stolen glances and overheard whispers. He had once carried firewood into the cellar during a gathering, and in that instant caught sight of the altar draped in red cloth. He remembered the smell, iron and smoke, and the way the men's voices echoed like a sermon delivered to something not of God. He had learned caution, for caution meant survival. To speak of such things to the others would bring nothing but punishment or worse. Yet Jonah's memory held on to those sights like wounds that refused to close. And when Eliza sought him out once more, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders, he recognized the same fire in her eyes. "I found his ledger," she whispered one night at the edge of the grove, her voice breaking with urgency. "It holds names, your people's names. My mother's name. All marked as if they were nothing but—" She stopped herself, pressing the shawl to her lips. "He has kept record of every life taken here." Jonah said nothing at first, his jaw hardening. To hear confirmation from her, confirmation of what he had always suspected, was like a blade twisting deeper. "You should have burned it," he muttered finally. "No," Eliza said, her voice trembling but fierce. "If I destroy it, there will be nothing left. Nothing to prove the truth. They will keep their power, keep their lies. But with this," she touched her shawl as if feeling the ledger through the fabric, "someday they will be judged." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "Someday won't help the ones already gone." Her gaze met his, steady now. "Then help me. You have seen more than I. Together we might piece it together. Together we might end it." Jonah turned away, staring into the swamp where mist curled low across the water. To conspire with her was madness. A single word from her lips could condemn him to a whipping post or worse. Yet something in her voice carried the same weight as the stories his grandmother once told, stories of justice deferred but never denied. At last he nodded once. From then on, the two moved like shadows within the estate. Eliza copied portions of the ledger by candlelight, smuggling slips of parchment hidden in her hems. Jonah whispered fragments of what he had overheard, the brethren's plans for another great gathering that winter, a night when all 13 would be present, sealing their pact anew. Together they pieced the truth. The symbols were not mere decoration but markers of ritual sacrifice. Each crossed-out name belonged to someone taken, their death offered to the brethren's cause. The ledger was less an account book than a map of blood. As the pieces fell into place, so too did a grim resolve. "They will gather again," Jonah said, his voice low as they stood one night beneath the cypress trees. "All of them. 13 in number. That may be the only chance." Eliza clutched the copied pages to her chest. "A chance for what?" "For ending it," Jonah said simply. The marsh wind stirred, carrying with it the distant sound of dogs barking. Both fell silent, knowing they could not speak further there. But the thought remained between them, unspoken yet clear. Willowmarsh's darkness could not continue unchallenged. Eliza's hands shook as she wrote that night, her quill scratching furiously across the page. She wrote of the brethren's cruelty, of her father's deception, of the ledger's damning record. She wrote of Jonah, though never by name, calling him only the witness. In her journals, their fates were entwined, two souls bound together by a house that devoured the powerless and cloaked the guilty in honor. When she finished, she placed the pages beneath the ledger once more, pressing the boards back into place. The sound of her father's footsteps echoed down the hall, heavy and slow. Eliza froze, holding her breath until the steps faded. She did not know how much time remained before her father discovered the theft, or before the brethren gathered again. But she knew one thing with certainty: the ledger had shifted the ground beneath her feet. There was no turning back. And in the heart of Willow Marsh, in the flickering shadows of the cellar where the ledger had first been kept, the brethren prepared for their next ritual, unaware that their secrets were beginning to unravel. The house groaned in the night as if sensing the storm that was coming. The year was autumn of 1845, and the marshes around Willow Marsh Manor lay heavy with mist. The damp air clung to the lungs of anyone foolish enough to wander through the reeds after nightfall. Locals whispered of strange music carried on the wind, and of candlelight flickering from deep beneath the earth. Few dared to draw near, for the manor, though outwardly abandoned, was not truly empty. It belonged to those who gathered when the moon was low, when shadows deepened, when oaths were carved not upon parchment but into flesh. That night, 13 figures arrived one by one at the crooked gates. They came cloaked, their faces hidden by hoods or shawls, as though even the mist itself might testify against them. Each carried something in hand, an offering, a token, or a tool meant for the work that was to come. The heavy doors of the manor groaned open to admit them, but no servant greeted them, no master welcomed them. They were both servants and masters of their own design, bound together by the hunger of secrecy. Inside, the manor stank of mildew, burnt wax, and something sharper, iron perhaps, though some swore it was blood. The grand hall, once a place of banquets and laughter, was bare but for torn draperies and the broken shell of a long-unused hearth. From there, a spiral staircase descended into the earth. One by one they followed, the glow of their candles snaking downward like a trail of fire into the bowels of the manor. The cellar chamber was the true heart of Willow Marsh. No wine cask stood there, no provisions of grain or salted meat. Instead, a stone altar dominated the center of the floor. Its surface bore the stains of older gatherings, dark rings where blood had been poured, and faint scratches where knives had bitten too deeply. Candles lined the walls, their smoke painting the ceiling with ghostly patterns. A circle had been etched into the floor, scored by hand with precision, 13 points forming a ring, each waiting to be occupied. They took their places without speaking, for the ritual was older than their fellowship, and each knew their station. The leader, a tall figure whose cloak was lined with crimson thread, stood at the head of the altar. His hands were bare, and in his grip he held a chalice carved from horn, darkened with age. When he raised it, the chamber stilled, and only the sputter of wax and the distant drip of water from the marsh above filled the silence. "Brothers and sisters," he intoned, his voice echoing against stone, "we meet again as sworn upon the waning of the year. 13 shall gather, and 13 shall bind themselves anew. In darkness we pledge, in blood we seal." A murmur rippled through the circle as each echoed his words. Then one by one they drew small blades from their garments. Some were daggers, some mere sharpened tools, but all had seen use before. Each pressed steel to skin, palms, forearms, or fingertips, and crimson welled forth, dripping onto the stones. The leader moved from point to point, collecting drops into the horn chalice. By the time he returned to the altar, the vessel was half filled, the mingled blood a grim communion. He lifted it high. "So long as Willow Marsh stands, so long shall we remain bound. Let none break the circle, lest their flesh be forfeit." They drank in turn, each taking the chalice, pressing it to their lips and swallowing the metallic warmth. Some trembled, others smiled faintly, but none refused. To refuse was to mark oneself as traitor, and the brethren had no tolerance for betrayal. More than one shallow grave in the marsh bore witness to that truth. Once the chalice had passed through all hands, the leader placed it upon the altar and drew out a small leather-bound book. Its pages, yellowed and brittle, contained the names of those who had gathered in years past. Many entries were marked through with a line of ink, or a line of something darker, dried into the parchment. Tonight he opened to a fresh page. Autumn 1845. "The 13 of Willow Marsh do swear their bond." He read each name aloud. With every utterance, the one so-called stepped forward, pricked a finger again, and let a drop fall upon the page, staining it. When the circle was complete, the book was shut with a snap, and a heavy iron clasp fastened across it. Now the ritual turned from oath to offering. A young lamb, trembling and wide-eyed, was brought forth from a sack. Its bleating filled the cellar, pitiful against the cold stone. None faltered. The leader's blade flashed, swift and deliberate, and the altar drank again. The lamb's cries died, and silence fell heavier than before. Some pressed hands into the pooling blood, smearing it across their brows. Others whispered prayers not found in any holy book, prayers meant only for the ears of whatever they served. A scent filled the air, part smoke, part blood, part something fouler, as though the earth itself exhaled. When at last the ritual ended, the candles guttered. The brethren filed upward again, leaving the chamber to its silence. Above, the mist still clung to Willow Marsh. The moon hung pale and no sound stirred the reeds. Yet those who passed through the village in days that followed swore the marsh had grown thicker, the air heavier, the nights longer. Farmers complained of livestock vanishing. Children whispered of faces seen in the mist, watching, waiting. And always, 13 shadows lingered at the edge of every fearful tale, 13 names bound by oath and blood, 13 souls who had given themselves not to God, nor to men, but to something far older, crouching in the silence beneath Willow Marsh. The morning after the gathering, Willow Marsh Manor appeared as lifeless as ever. Sunlight crept timidly across the marsh, shrouded by a lingering fog that refused to lift. The villagers, cautious by nature, avoided the estate's shadow. Yet within its rotting walls, those who served remained, bound not by choice but by chains. Some visible, others invisible, yet no less heavy. Among them was Eliza, a woman no longer young, though the harshness of her life had carved lines upon her face far deeper than her years would warrant. She had been born into servitude and had grown accustomed to silence. Her tongue was quick and clever, but every word was weighed against the lash of punishment. She had seen too much, heard too much, and long ago learned the cost of speaking truth. That morning, she found herself scrubbing the dried stains from the stone steps leading down into the cellar. The marks were stubborn, dark and clotted, refusing to fade. Each swipe of her rag smeared them rather than erased them. She whispered under her breath, not prayers but fragments of old songs, half to calm herself, half to drown out the memory of the lamb's scream from the night before. A shadow moved near her. She stiffened, but it was only Jonah, a younger man who had been sold into Willowmarsh's service 2 winters ago. His back bore fresh scars, and his eyes carried a fire that had not yet been extinguished by cruelty. He carried a bucket of water, setting it down without a word, then crouched to scrub beside her. For a time only the rasp of cloth on stone filled the air. At length Jonah spoke in a low voice, pitched so only she could hear. "I saw them. Last night." Eliza's hand froze. Her eyes darted toward the stairwell, half expecting one of the cloaked brethren to appear. None came. Still she hissed sharply, "Hush, boy. Walls have ears." "I don't care," Jonah muttered, his jaw tightening. "They gathered down here. I heard the chanting. I smelled the blood." His gaze flicked toward the altar, still stained despite their efforts. "This ain't the work of men. They give themselves to something foul." Eliza pressed the rag hard against the stone, grinding at a stubborn mark. "You think I don't know? I've been here longer than you've been breathing. Every year the same. 13 of them sealing their wicked bargain." She paused, lowering her voice to nearly nothing. "Those who speak of it, vanish." Jonah's hands stilled, but his eyes burned brighter. "Then let me vanish if that's the price. I won't bow to this. They think they can bind us with silence, but I won't be part of it." Her gaze flicked to his, startled by his defiance. She saw in him the recklessness of youth, the same fire that had once burned in her own chest, before it was smothered by years of fear. Something stirred in her, a memory of what it was to resist, to hope. "Careful," she whispered, softer now. "Your words could get us both buried in the marsh. These men, these brethren, they've power. Not just coin, not just whip and chain. Power darker than that. You heard the lamb die, same as me. That was no common sacrifice." Jonah leaned closer, his voice steady. "Then let us fight darkness with truth. Let us tell what we know." Her breath caught. To speak of it aloud, even here in the cellar, felt like pressing her palm against fire. Yet the thought had gnawed at her for years, rising each time she scrubbed the stains, each time she served them wine, each time she watched them walk away unchallenged. "And who would hear us?" she said bitterly. "The villagers? They fear Willowmarsh more than they fear God. The law, bought and paid for by the brethren. No one will raise a hand against them." Jonah's voice dropped, almost pleading. "Then we don't beg for others to act. We act ourselves." The word struck her like a hammer blow. She looked at him, truly looked. His youth was not merely foolish, it was courageous. She had forgotten what courage looked like. Slowly she wrung out the rag, water dripping red into the bucket. "You'd risk your life?" she asked. "I'd rather lose it fighting," he said simply, "than live another day serving devils in human shape." Eliza's hands trembled. She pressed them flat to her lap as though steadying herself. In that moment the weight of silence, the years of swallowed truths, of watching horror with lips pressed shut, felt heavier than any chain. At last she whispered, "Then we must be clever. We must plan. One word spoken at the wrong time, one wrong ear hearing it, and they'll bury us where no one will ever find us." A slow nod passed between them. It was not a pact written in ink or sealed in blood, but it was no less binding. In the damp cellar of Willowmarsh, amid the stains of ritual and the stench of fear, Eliza and Jonah formed their fragile alliance. 4 days they spoke little for fear of watchers. Their conversations were broken into fragments, exchanged in hurried whispers while sweeping halls or tending fires. Each word was guarded, yet each built upon the last. They knew they could not confront the brethren directly, not yet. But perhaps there was a way to reveal them, to lay bare their corruption so others could no longer deny it. Jonah suggested fire, burning the manor to the ground, taking the altar and the book with it. Eliza shook her head. "Fire leaves only ash. Ash does not speak. We need proof, something they cannot explain away." It was then she spoke of the book. The leather-bound ledger the leader had read from, the one in which their names were inscribed with drops of blood. She had glimpsed it before, carried in and out of the cellar, always kept close by the crimson-cloaked figure. If they could seize it, just once, just long enough, it might be enough to show the villagers the truth. But how? Jonah asked. She frowned, considering. "Patience. The brethren grow careless in their confidence. There will be a night when their guard slips. We must wait, and when that night comes, we must act quickly. Their whispers wove into a web of plans, tentative yet stubborn. It was not yet rebellion, not yet open defiance, but it was the seed of both. And in Willow Marsh, even a seed was dangerous, for the soil was soaked with fear, and anything that grew from it would be twisted into something hard and unyielding. As days turned to weeks, the manor's routines returned. The brethren went about their worldly affairs, cloaked in respectability by day, cloaked in secrecy by night. But beneath their notice, Eliza and Jonah moved quietly, their bond deepening. Neither spoke of trust aloud, but trust grew nonetheless, born of shared silence, shared danger, and the fragile dream that one day the circle of 13 might be broken. The nights at Willow Marsh carried their own silence, thicker than the fog that rolled across the marshes. Crickets hushed when the brethren gathered. Even the owls, who claimed dominion of the dark, seemed to retreat from the manor when the cellar doors groaned open. It was on such a night that Eliza found herself summoned again to prepare the lower chambers. Her body obeyed out of habit, but her mind was restless, racing with fragments of whispered plans shared with Jonah. Every step she took down the stone stairwell seemed heavier than the last, as though the air itself tried to drag her back. The cellar was dimly lit by iron sconces, their flames fluttering against the damp walls. The altar loomed in the center, carved from granite and streaked with stains that never faded no matter how many times she scrubbed. On its surface rested the ledger, that cursed book, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with the names of men who believed themselves untouchable. Eliza paused, staring at it. She knew what it contained. She had seen the brethren dip their quills into bowls of blood, pressing ink and life together onto parchment. The ledger was proof of everything, their pact, their victims, their crimes. And it sat only feet away. Her hands shook as she lit the last candle. She wanted to snatch the book then and there, to flee into the marsh before the brethren arrived. But she forced herself still. Impulse would get her killed. She had promised Jonah they would wait for the right moment. By the time she had finished, shadows lengthened on the walls. The cellar door opened, and the brethren filed in, their crimson cloaks whispering as they descended. 13 men, each face half concealed by the hoods of their order. They moved with the solemnity of priests, though no true faith guided them, only hunger for power. Among them was Bartholomew Crane, the manor's master and the man whose hand had long ruled Eliza's life with cruelty. He carried himself like a prophet, his voice thick with command as he began the chant. One by one, the brethren circled the altar, their tones weaving into a low hum that seemed to crawl along the cellar walls. Then the victims were brought in. 2 young men, shackled at the wrists, were dragged forward by hired guards. Their eyes were wide, darting from the altar to the cloaked figures. Neither struggled. Fear had stolen their strength long before they reached the cellar. Eliza's stomach churned. She turned her face aside, though her ears caught every sound, the scrape of chains, the muffled sobs, the crack of whip handles used to force the captives to kneel. She wanted to run, to close her ears and blind her eyes, but she did not. Instead, she did something far more dangerous. She watched. Not openly but carefully, with eyes lowered and movements subdued, she began to memorize every detail. Who held the knife? Who read from the ledger? Whose hands trembled when the first cut was made? She forced herself to keep count of each word of the ritual, each symbol carved into the captive's skin. Every detail was a weapon. If she could hold it long enough, if she could pass it to Jonah, it might one day strike back against the brethren. Jonah was there too, his presence hidden in the shadows beyond the torchlight. He had been ordered to haul water barrels into the cellar earlier in the evening, a task menial enough that no one paid him mind. But he lingered after, crouched near the far wall where the darkness deepened. From there he could see more than he was meant to. His heart pounded so loudly he feared they would hear it. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet he stayed. His hand brushed against the stone, finding the loose crack he had discovered days before. Inside it he had hidden a small scrap of parchment and a stub of charcoal, tools for smuggling out the truth. As the ritual unfolded, Jonah pressed the charcoal to parchment, scrawling crooked lines in the dark. He wrote the names he overheard, the words of the chant, the symbols carved into flesh. His writing was jagged, hurried, but it was a record, a fragment of proof. Eliza, glancing up between motions of servitude, caught sight of him once. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat. She gave no sign, but a current passed between them. Hold steady. Do not falter. The ritual dragged on. The brethren chanted, swayed, invoked powers unseen. The captives grew weaker, their cries breaking into ragged silence. Eliza's mind screamed at her to look away, but her resolve hardened. Every horror she witnessed, she pressed deep into memory, shaping it into a silent testimony. At last, the chamber filled with the copper stench of blood and the sickly sweetness of burning herbs. Bartholomew Crane lifted the ledger, dipping the quill into a bowl that had once held wine and now held blood. His voice thundered through the chamber as he read aloud the names of those present, sealing yet another cycle of their cursed pact. Jonah's hand scribbled furiously. The parchment tore under the pressure, but he forced the stub to keep moving, dragging inkless marks where charcoal failed. Anything, he thought desperately. Anything to carry out of here. And then, silence. The ritual ended as abruptly as it had begun. The brethren bowed their heads, satisfied, and filed out in grim procession. Guards dragged the lifeless bodies toward the marsh, where the swamp would swallow them as it had so many before. Only when the final footsteps faded did Eliza dare to breathe freely. She turned her back to the altar, hands trembling as she began the ritual of cleaning, the twisted irony of erasing evidence of the brethren's wickedness with her own hands. In the shadows, Jonah waited until the last guard disappeared. Then he slid the scrap of parchment from the crack in the stone and tucked it beneath his shirt. His heart thundered, but his steps were steady as he slipped from the cellar, blending into the darkness above. Later, when the manor slept, Jonah found Eliza by the servants' quarters. He pulled the scrap free, unfolding it with care. The charcoal had smudged and the parchment was ragged, but it bore what no one else dared to carry, the truth. Eliza traced the rough letters with a trembling finger. This could damn them. Or damn us, Jonah whispered. If they find it, it's our lives. She folded it quickly, tucking it deep into the hem of her dress. Then we hide it, one piece at a time. One scrap becomes two become 10. And when the time comes, we'll have enough to tear them down. Jonah met her gaze, the fire in his eyes tempered now by fear but not extinguished. Then we must be patient. Eliza nodded. Her voice was low but resolute. Patient and careful. The cellar keeps its shadows but will carry its truth into the light. That night, as the marsh swallowed the cries of the dead, 2 servants of Willow Marsh held between them a fragile, dangerous hope. It was small as a scrap of parchment, yet weighty enough to shake the pillars of the manor itself. The plan was never spoken of plainly. Eliza and Jonah knew better than to risk words. It was a plan built in fragments, glances exchanged while hauling water, murmurs carried under the crackle of kitchen fires, silent gestures in passing. But when the right night came, there was no doubt between them. They both knew. The brethren had gathered again. Their crimson cloaks swayed like shadows as they descended into the cellar, chanting low and steady. Oil lamps flickered in their hands, casting halos of light against damp stone. Outside, the marsh wind rose, rattling the shutters of Willow Marsh as if the house itself sensed what was about to happen. Eliza had been ordered to prepare the cellar earlier that evening. Instead of cleaning the altar with care, she poured the last of the lamp oil across the stones, her motions deliberate, masked as clumsiness. She laid extra kindling along the edges of the chamber, where shadows would swallow the sight of it. Each drop of oil shimmered on the stone like a dark mirror, waiting for flame. Jonah, carrying buckets of water for the brethren's post-ritual washing, had slipped a flask of turpentine beneath his shirt. His hands were steady, though his heart thundered. He had waited for this moment too long to falter now. The ritual dragged on. 13 men stood in their circle, voices rising in unholy unison. The smell of herbs and blood thickened the air. Eliza moved among them, head bowed, carrying bowls, replacing candles, her steps precise. No one noticed her trembling fingers. No one questioned the faint gleam of oil trailing along the floor. At the edge of the chamber, Jonah waited. He saw Eliza glance toward him only once, but it was enough. The time had come. As the leader raised the ledger to record their pact, Jonah uncorked the turpentine flask and tipped it across the kindling stacked near the stairwell. The sharp, biting scent cut through the cellar's musty air. One of the brethren frowned, half turning, but Eliza moved quickly, dropping a silver dish so that it clattered against the stones. The sound snapped every hooded head toward her. She bowed low, murmuring apologies, her hands gathering the scattered pieces. By the time their suspicion dulled, Jonah had slipped the empty flask back into his coat. The ritual ended. The brethren, their work complete, clustered around the altar to recite the final vow. Their voices echoed, deep and guttural, filling the cellar with a resonance that seemed almost to hum through the stone. And then, Eliza moved. She lit a taper from the nearest sconce. Her hands no longer trembled. She carried it as though it were merely another task, another servant's duty. But instead of setting it upon the altar, she lowered it to the oil-soaked kindling at her feet. The fire caught with a whisper, then a roar. Flames surged across the floor, racing along the trail of oil, leaping to the walls, licking at the altar itself. In an instant the cellar was ablaze. Chaos erupted. Cloaked men shouted, stumbling back as smoke rose in choking billows. One tripped on his own robes, his screams swallowed by fire. Another rushed toward the stairwell only to find the flames already blocking the way. The ledger slid from the altar, its pages curling, edges blackening in the heat. "Eliza!" Jonah's voice rang out through the din. He had already reached the stairs, finding a narrow gap between the flames where escape was still possible. She ran toward him, her skirts singed at the hem, her lungs seared by smoke. Behind her, the brethren clawed at one another, their masks of dignity stripped away in terror. Bartholomew Crane's voice rose above the rest, shrieking orders, curses, prayers, no one could tell which. A timber above groaned, split, and collapsed, showering sparks across the chamber. Eliza stumbled, but Jonah's hand caught hers, pulling her up the last steps. Together they burst through the cellar door, slamming it shut behind them as the inferno roared below. They staggered into the manor's main hall, coughing, eyes watering. Already the fire had spread upward, smoke curling along the rafters. Curtains caught, tapestries smoldered. Willowmarsh itself seemed eager to devour the men who had long corrupted its halls. "Out!" Jonah gasped, pulling Eliza toward the side entrance. They burst into the night air just as another explosion thundered within, a beam collapsing into the flames. The marsh wind carried sparks high into the dark sky. From the nearby plantations, others would see the glow soon. Questions would come. But by then Eliza and Jonah would be gone. They stood together in the yard, watching as fire consumed Willow Marsh. The screams of the brethren rose and fell within the inferno, until at last they were smothered by the roar of collapsing timbers. 13 men who had bound themselves to darkness were silenced by flame. For a long moment neither spoke. The only sound was the crackling of fire and the groan of wood surrendering to heat. Finally Jonah turned to her. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes raw but alive. "It's done." Eliza's gaze never left the blaze. "No. It's only begun." He frowned, not understanding. "The ledger burned, yes," she said quietly, "but I took what mattered before the flames touched it." From within her dress she pulled the folded scrap she had hidden. The names Jonah had scrawled, the symbols, the words. It was smudged, half-torn, but still legible. Proof enough. Jonah stared, his breath caught between relief and dread. "If anyone finds that—" "They won't," she said firmly. "Not until the time is right. Truth must survive us even if we do not." The fire rose higher, devouring roof and tower alike. The great manor cracked, shuddered, and fell inward with a roar. Sparks soared skyward, vanishing into the night like fleeing souls. Together Eliza and Jonah stood until Willowmarsh was nothing but ash and embers. Then without another word they turned and walked in opposite directions. Eliza toward the distant glow of Charleston, Jonah west toward the frontier. They did not look back. Behind them the marsh whispered, carrying away the smoke, swallowing the last echoes of the men who had believed themselves untouchable. The dawn broke with the crackle of flames. Willowmarsh, once a place of whispered secrets and quiet dread, was now a furnace. The dry wood of its barns and crooked homes caught fire easily, as though the whole settlement had been waiting for this moment of destruction. Black smoke lifted into the pale sky, staining the horizon like a wound that would not heal. Eliza stood at the edge of the burning town, her dress damp with the morning dew, her hands trembling not from the chill but from the knowledge that this was the end. She pressed her lips together, trying to keep her grief from spilling out. Jonah was beside her, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. He did not move, did not blink, only watched as the inferno consumed the place that had shaped and scarred them both. "It had to burn," Jonah said at last, his voice hoarse. "Places like this, they don't deserve to remain." Eliza swallowed, tasting ash in her throat. "And the people?" she asked quietly. "Do they deserve to vanish with it?" Jonah turned to her, the lines of exhaustion deep on his face. "Some truths are too heavy to carry. Let the fire take them. What matters is what we keep alive, not the ruins." The words struck her like a bell. He was right in his way. But she also knew that stories erased were stories repeated, and that silence could be more dangerous than flames. For a long time neither of them spoke. They listened instead to the collapse of beams, the shriek of metal as it warped, the roar of fire devouring the town. The sound was less like destruction and more like absolution, as if the land itself had demanded this ending. At last, Eliza broke the silence. "Where will you go?" Jonah's gaze lingered on the flames, but his thoughts were already far beyond them. "West. Past the rivers. There's land no one's claimed yet. Maybe there I can start over. A place without chains." Eliza nodded slowly, her eyes wet. "And I," she hesitated, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Philadelphia. North. There are people there who speak of freedom, not just for themselves but for everyone. If there's any place the truth might be written down, it's there." Jonah finally turned toward her. His expression softened, though sorrow weighed heavy on him. "You'll be safer there. Safer than with me." "Safety," Eliza whispered almost bitterly. "I don't think that word belongs to us anymore." Jonah allowed himself the smallest of smiles, but it faded quickly. "Then call it something else. Call it survival." Eliza looked at him, memorizing the way the firelight carved shadows along his jaw, the way his eyes carried both defiance and weariness. She knew this was the last time she would see him, at least in this life. And though she longed to reach for his hand, to hold on to some fragment of what they had endured together, she forced herself to remain still. Their bond was not one of touch but of truth, and that would be enough. "Jonah," she said softly, promise me this isn't the end of it. Promise me the truth won't vanish with this town." Jonah's throat tightened. He wanted to promise safety, reunion, even peace, but those words would have been lies. Instead, he reached for the only truth he could give. "I promise," he said, his voice steady. "Even if I don't carry it, someone will. The fire can't burn everything. Not if we don't let it." The weight of that vow settled between them, heavier than any chain they had ever borne. Eliza turned back toward the town, watching the last roof collapse in on itself. Smoke rose high, a black banner announcing the end of Willow Marsh to the heavens. The fire had reduced it to ash, but in her chest burned something else, a determination that no flames could extinguish. At length she stepped back. The world beyond the fire waited for her, uncertain, dangerous, but hers to claim. She tightened her shawl again and began to walk northward, her figure shrinking against the vastness of the horizon. Jonah remained, watching her go. Every step she took was a thread pulling taut inside him, a reminder of what he was letting go. But he did not follow. He could not. His path lay elsewhere, westward into the wilderness, into the unknown. When at last she disappeared from view, Jonah whispered into the smoke as if the ashes themselves might carry his words to her. "Hold on to it, Eliza. Hold on to the truth." Then he turned away from the fire and began his own walk, each step echoing the weight of survival, of promises made, of a past that would forever burn behind him. The two figures parted, one north, one west, their destinies severed by distance but bound by memory. And behind them, Willow Marsh continued to burn until nothing remained but silence and ash. The fire at Willow Marsh was not remembered as truth. By the end of that week, while smoke still rose faintly from the blackened ruins, the story had already been rewritten. In Charleston, Savannah, and further north in Philadelphia, headlines announced the same neat version of events. "Tragic fire claims lives in isolated southern village." The words were printed in clean black type, as if clarity could make them honest. There was no mention of cruelty, no whisper of rebellion, no hint of the chains that had bound the people who once walked the dirt roads of Willow Marsh. Only fire, only accident, only tragedy. For those who survived, the lie cut deeper than the flames. The funerals. Church bells tolled in nearby towns, their chimes somber but hollow. Ministers spoke from pulpits of God's mysterious will and the fragility of earthly life. Families dressed in black gathered in pews, their faces bowed not in grief but in performance. Coffins were lined up, polished oak carried by men who had never seen the bodies they claimed to bury. For most of the dead, there were no remains to mourn, only ash swept into boxes, labeled and lowered into the ground. Dirt was shoveled over lies. At one funeral, a preacher raised his hand toward the heavens and declared, "Let this stand as a warning of fire's fury and the need for vigilance in our homes and hearths." No mention of chains. No mention of those who had prayed for freedom until the last breath. Just hearths, homes, and vigilance, words as polished as the coffins themselves. The mourners nodded, eyes dry. The truth had been buried deeper than the caskets. The eulogies. Newspapers published eulogies for respected citizens of Willow Marsh. A plantation matron remembered for her generosity. A trader praised for his enterprise. Even a sheriff who, the obituary claimed, had kept the peace in turbulent times. Eliza read these words days later in Philadelphia, the paper trembling in her hands. She felt bile rise in her throat as she scanned column after column of false praise. These were not lives of virtue. They had been lives of cruelty, of hands soaked in blood and profit wrung from suffering. But the eulogies would remain ink on paper, folded neatly into archives, while the real stories of the enslaved, their songs, their prayers, their whispered names for freedom, turned to dust in the fire. Jonah never saw the eulogies. By the time they were printed, he was already west of the rivers, sleeping under unfamiliar stars. But even without reading, he knew the story that would spread. He had seen it too many times before, every uprising smothered, every cruelty excused, every truth recast as accident or necessity. The dispersal. Those enslaved who had survived were not granted the dignity of mourning. Survivors were treated not as people but as property salvaged from fire. Plantation ledgers in surrounding counties swelled with new entries, names crossed out and replaced, bodies reassigned as if one could erase a history with a quill. Families were broken again. Mothers sold away from children. Husbands sent miles distant from wives. The silence of loss hung heavier than the smoke still drifting from Willow Marsh. On one auction block, a man who had once prayed aloud during the final hours of the fire kept his lips sealed. Not a word left his mouth. Silence, he realized, was the only weapon left. What had been spoken in prayer was now buried in ash, but silence could keep it from being twisted further. Others carried fragments. A song hummed under breath while carrying water. A name scratched quietly into the back of a wooden beam. A prayer whispered at dawn, unmarked by ears of the overseer. Fragments but alive. The paper trail. Clerks in Charleston compiled the official record. They documented how the fire had started in the upper loft of a barn, how the blaze had spread swiftly due to wind, how, despite noble efforts, lives were tragically lost. The report concluded with a chilling line. No evidence suggests foul play or discontent among the servants of the town. Eliza read those words again and again, her stomach knotting tighter each time. She wanted to tear the paper apart, scatter it to the streets, scream the truth loud enough to crack the walls of the print shop. But the world around her kept moving, indifferent. Vendors called out their wares, children darted between carts, and men in suits read the same false story she held without flinching. The truth was ashes in her hands, while lies were bound in ink. The archivist's warning. Weeks later, Eliza visited the Free Library in Philadelphia. She sought out a gray-haired archivist known for collecting testimonies others ignored. When she handed him the newspaper clippings, her hands shook. He read in silence, his brows furrowed, then set the papers aside. "This will be what they remember," he said gravely. 50 years from now, scholars will point to these columns and call it history." Eliza's voice cracked as she whispered, "But it's not the truth." The archivist nodded slowly. "History rarely is." He leaned closer, his eyes sharp despite his years. "If you want the truth remembered, write it down yourself. Hide it if you must. Pass it hand to hand. Let the world bury their version, but don't let yours vanish." It was not comfort he offered, but a charge. Eliza left the library that evening with blank pages hidden under her shawl. She would write. She would remember. The lie that lived. Months turned into years and the official story endured. Visitors spoke of Willow Marsh only as the town lost to fire. Schoolmasters in the South cited it as a cautionary tale of poor construction, of neglectful watchmen. Preachers used it in sermons to warn of God's sudden judgment. Every retelling stripped it further from the truth, until it was not memory but fable, a lesson about flames, never about chains. And yet, in quiet corners, the fragments survived. A song hummed by a mother to her child, though the child did not know its origin. A line in Eliza's hidden pages, written by candlelight when the city slept. A wordless silence from Jonah, carried westward into the prairies, where he told no one but remembered all. The lie lived loudly. But the truth lived quietly, stubborn as roots beneath scorched earth. By the time the last embers of Willow Marsh cooled, the official story had already been bound, sealed, and spread. But somewhere, in scattered pages, in whispers, in silence, the real story waited. Not dead. Not forgotten. Just hidden. The ruins of Willow Marsh did not last long. By the 1850s, nature had already begun reclaiming the charred foundations. Vines curled over broken stones, moss spread across blackened timbers, and weeds rose from soil still faintly smelling of ash. Birds returned to nest where windows had once held glass. To the unknowing eye, It looked like any other abandoned settlement lost to fire and time. But among those who had lived in its shadow, Willow Marsh was not forgotten. Its silence was heavy, not empty. The stories that survived. In the scattered cabins of enslaved communities across South Carolina, whispers carried through long nights. Children leaned close to elders as stories were told in hushed tones, voices barely louder than the crackle of the fire. They thought themselves gods, the elders would say, but one night the fire took them. It was never told the same way twice. In one version, lightning struck the house of cruelty. In another, angels descended, wings aflame, to cleanse the land of blood. In still another, it was the ancestors themselves rising from the grave to take vengeance. But beneath the changes, one truth never shifted: the masters burned. This phrase became a refrain repeated like scripture. The night the masters burned. The night chains cracked. The night power crumbled to ash. For those still enslaved, it was more than a story. It was a reminder. Cruelty was not untouchable. Justice, though delayed, could come like fire in the night. The vanishing. Yet with each retelling, parts of the story vanished. The names of the men who perished blurred into faceless villains. The names of the enslaved who risked everything were lost altogether, erased by time and fear. Eliza's hidden writings had not yet been found, and Jonah's silence meant the story had no chronicler. What remained was not history but folklore, carried in breath and bone. For some, that was enough. Folklore lived where history could not. It endured in song, in whispered prayers, in stories that could be told without paper or ink. But it also shifted. By the eve of the Civil War, the whispers of Willow Marsh had become less memory and more myth. A parable told to children, that no master could build a house strong enough to withstand the fire of justice. The war arrives. In 1864, 2 decades after the flames consumed Willow Marsh, war came. Union soldiers marched through the Lowcountry, their boots pressing into soil long soaked in blood. Plantations emptied in their wake, the enslaved fleeing toward freedom or forced into labor camps by blue uniforms instead of gray. One regiment came upon the land where Willow Marsh had once stood. By then only fragments remained, broken stone foundations, a scattering of bricks, a cellar collapsed into itself. Vines tangled over what had been the Grand Hall. The soldiers camped nearby, using the ruins as a landmark. It was then they made discoveries the whispers had hinted at but never proved. Beneath the earth, digging for firewood and cover, soldiers uncovered a tunnel system beneath the ruins, narrow passages carved into the earth, lined with rotting timber supports. They were not simple root cellars nor storm shelters. They wound deeper, their purpose unclear but unsettling. At the end of one collapsed passage, bones surfaced, brittle, yellowed, half swallowed by soil. Some were animal, others human. A skull with a broken jaw. A child's femur, small and fragile. Soldiers muttered uneasily, some crossing themselves, others spitting curses into the dirt. "Place reeks of devils," one wrote in his diary. Another entry from the same regiment described markings carved into tree trunks along the swamp's edge. Strange symbols, half faded, gouged deep as though to last. No soldier could interpret them. Some thought them ritual. Others dismissed them as the scratches of bored men with knives. But whispers spread among the troops, just as they had among the enslaved years before. They said Willow Marsh had been a place of dark rites, that fire had come not by accident but by judgment. An uneasy occupation. The soldiers stayed only 3 nights, but none rested easy. Campfires burned brighter than usual, as if men feared what the dark would hold if the flames grew low. Even hardened veterans spoke in hushed voices when the wind shifted and carried with it the faint scent of smoke, though no fire burned. On the final night, one soldier recorded hearing singing from the swamp. The voice was low, mournful, carrying words he could not understand. When he and 2 others followed the sound, they found nothing but cypress trees standing in black water, their roots twisted like grasping hands. The singing ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The men hurried back, shaken, unwilling to speak of it further. By dawn, the regiment moved on, leaving the ruins behind. Willow Marsh was not a place to linger. What the soldiers took. Before leaving, some soldiers carried away relics. A brass candlestick pulled from the rubble. A scorched book, its pages too damaged to read. A small carved figure, blackened but intact, its face strangely featureless. These items found their way north, scattered among trunks and attics. Years later, descendants would open dusty boxes and find them without context. Odd keepsakes with no story. The truth of where they came from had already begun to slip away. But among the soldiers themselves rumors lingered. Men who had camped at Willow Marsh spoke of it in taverns and letters for years, their accounts filled with unease. A few claimed to dream of fire long after, waking in the night to the imagined crackle of flames and the scent of smoke. The war swallowed their testimonies. Other battles, larger massacres, greater horrors demanded the world's attention. Willow Marsh faded once more, a footnote, an afterthought. But not entirely gone. Whispers endure. Long after the soldiers marched away, whispers continued to thread through the region. Formerly enslaved families who had once lived in Willow Marsh's shadow told their children fragments of what had happened. They burned, a grandmother would whisper, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The masters burned. No explanation followed. No context. Just the simple truth preserved like a seed, ready to grow when the soil was right. It was not history in the way newspapers or ledgers recorded history. It was something older, something carried not on ink but on memory. Whispers, songs, silences. The kind of truth that does not need permission to endure. Willow Marsh no longer stood. Its ruins had collapsed, its land sold, its story rewritten in ledgers and newspapers. But in the quiet, in fireside stories, in Union diaries, in songs without names, its shadow lived on. And sometimes, in the dark of night, when wind rustled the swamp grass and the trees creaked like voices in pain, those who passed near the land swore they could still hear it. The night the masters burned. The night the powerless found their power. The night cruelty met fire and silence carried the truth forward. The story of Willow Marsh might have ended in smoke and silence. For more than a century that seemed to be the case. The land was sold, the ruins dismantled, the earth plowed and replanted as if nothing had ever stood there. Generations passed without ever knowing what had burned or why. But truth has a way of refusing to die. 1974, the discovery. In the summer of 1974, demolition crews were tasked with clearing the last remaining outbuildings on what had once been Willow Marsh land. The site had already changed hands many times, its history forgotten by most. To the developers, it was simply acreage for a new subdivision, a convenient stretch of marshland near the highway. When the wrecking ball struck the stone wall of a crumbling carriage house, something unexpected tumbled out from the hollow space behind. It was a bundle wrapped tightly in oilcloth blackened by age. Workers pried it open, revealing a leather-bound journal, its pages brittle but intact. The foreman handed it over to the County Historical Society, assuming it was nothing more than a planter's ledger. But when archivists unwrapped the layers and began to read, their faces changed. The writing was precise, almost elegant, but the contents were not routine accounts. They spoke of gatherings in candlelit basements, of rituals performed in secret, of names and dates carefully catalogued. They spoke of cruelty, of men who believed themselves untouchable, of lives taken in darkness. At the center of it all was a name, Eliza Harrow. The code. The journal was not written in plain prose. Whole sections were encoded in symbols and substitutions. Scholars realized quickly that the writer had not wanted casual eyes to understand. It was a puzzle meant to outlast her lifetime, to protect the truth until someone could no longer silence it. What could be read without code was damning enough. References to 13 brethren, to sacrifices, to the reckoning by fire. The names of prominent families from Charleston and Savannah appeared in the margins. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the truth of Willow Marsh might finally come into daylight. The vanishing. But just as quickly as it surfaced, the journal disappeared. Within months of its discovery, the county records that listed it went missing. Archivists who had handled it claimed they were told to cease any further work. Some whispered that descendants of the old families had intervened, their influence still strong more than a century later. Officially, the journal was misplaced during transfer. No one could say where it had gone. Some believed it had been quietly destroyed, burned, shredded, or buried once more, this time under the weight of bureaucracy rather than soil. Others whispered that a private collector had it locked away in some vault, its words silenced by money and fear. But there are those who insist the journal is still out there, hidden, waiting for hands willing to open it again. The shadow that lingers. Even without the journal, fragments continue to surface. Oral histories recorded in the 1980s with descendants of enslaved families spoke of the fire that freed us, of masters burned in their own house. Folklorists dismissed these as exaggerations, myths born from suffering. But too many stories shared the same refrain. And in archives across the South, researchers stumbled on scraps. A letter from a Union soldier describing bones in the swamp, a diary entry from a merchant's wife recalling strange symbols carved in trees, a sermon warning of the dangers of secret brotherhoods. Taken together, the fragments painted a picture too consistent to ignore. Something had happened at Willow Marsh. Something had been buried. The questions that remain. Who exactly were the 13 men who died in the fire? Newspapers of 1842 listed them as pillars of the community, but the journal's encoded entries hinted at darker identities. What were the tunnels beneath the house? Were they escape routes, storage cellars, or chambers for rituals never meant to see daylight? And most haunting of all, did Eliza Harrow's coded words survive somewhere intact, waiting to be deciphered? Every theory ends in uncertainty. Some historians believe the entire story is too embellished, too cloaked in folklore to be trusted. Others argue that the persistence of the tale, carried in whispers, songs, and silences for over a century, is proof of a truth more powerful than records could capture. The haunting legacy. What is certain is this: Willow Marsh remains a scar, even when hidden beneath fresh paint and suburban lawns. Local children still whisper about it at sleepovers. Some claim to hear crackling fire when no one is burning wood. Others say they've seen a woman in a dark shawl wandering the marsh at night, holding a book tight to her chest before vanishing into the trees. Paranormal investigators who visited the site in the 1990s reported equipment failures, sudden bursts of static, and voices faintly caught on tape. One recording, when played back, carried a phrase so clear it chilled every listener. The masters burned. Whether it was real or a trick of interference, no one could say. But those words echoed the refrain passed down through generations, the refrain that refused to vanish. The power of memory. History books still do not tell the full story of Willow Marsh. In most records, it is nothing more than a tragic fire. But in memory, in whispers, in songs, in journals sealed and lost, it is something else entirely. It is a warning that cruelty can be consumed by its own flames. It is a reminder that silence can hold truth more stubbornly than ink. It is proof that power is never as permanent as it believes. The journal of Eliza Harrow may be gone, but her voice has never truly been silenced. It lingers in fragments, in echoes, in the haunting suggestion that somewhere the full account still waits. Outro, a chilling note. And so the tale of Willow Marsh closes not with certainty, but with unease. 13 men burned. One woman vanished. A journal appeared, then disappeared. All that remains is a story carried across generations, a story the powerful tried to bury, yet one that refuses to stay silent. Perhaps one day the journal will surface again, its code broken, its truths undeniable. Perhaps not. Until then, the question lingers like smoke in the air. What is still hidden in the ashes of Willow Marsh? Do you believe the journal was destroyed? Or do you think it waits somewhere in the dark, ready to be found? If you've walked with us through this chilling story, share it so others may remember. Subscribe for more histories that blur the line between truth and terror. Because some stories are too dangerous to die. And Willow Marsh will not be forgotten.